Hello, everyone, and welcome. This is Melissa.
Hi, it's Rachel again.
This is Harmoniously podcast. So, in today's podcast, we're going to talk about the experience during ketamine treatment. But before doing that, we'd like to tune in together into this podcast. So, let's just take a couple of breath. If you can close your eyes, and just let's take a breath to tune in into this moment. Let us ourselves arriving to the present and be fully present for this discussion. All right, we can open our eyes. All right, so Rachael here again to discuss about ketamine and about the experience. So last podcast we discussed about how to prepare. And so now we go into the experience itself. And I'm very excited because ketamine is definitely different than other psychedelic.
It is. It's a very, I think, different, and there can be for sure some similarities. So I'm excited to hear your input on some of the more themes that we sometimes see come up in consciousness and even in our subconscious during the experience. But there are some logistics too that are different. So we'll talk about a little bit of. I think maybe we should start at the beginning, right? So
Yes.
right? So in the beginning, the first portion of ketamine treatment is always the medication period. So the moment that we go to receive this medicine, to do our treatment, whatever it might be. And I think we covered a good amount of the stuff to do to kind of help prepare for these experiences in our last podcast. So for this one, we're kind of going to start at the moment we kind of ingest the medicine. Ketamine is a bit of a different compound, and in most of the oral troches or lozenges or rapid dissolving tabs that we prescribe for the home setting, these are medicines we're going to place in our mouth, and there may be 1 to 5 tablets that we're using based on your prescription. And in general, we're placing these tablets or tablet underneath our tongue or in the back of the cheek here, because the buccal membranes are actually these really absorptive kind of oral mucosa here. We get a really wonderful absorption of the medication here in the mouth. So a lot of people ask, well, why don't we just swallow the pill, or why don't I just swallow the tablet like you would with a lot of medicines? And the answer is interesting. So ketamine actually has a pretty limited bioavailability, meaning how much of the medicine we actually get that's, active for us in our body. And in the oral form is only about somewhere between 15 to 40% of it are we able to absorb.
Okay.
So if we were just to swallow this medicine, which we do in some of the other, types of medicines, what happens is this type of medicine can get kind of destroyed by stomach acid. It can get partially digested. And what ends up happening is you may still have a psychedelic experience, but it is more erratic and bizarre. So it could start 2 hours later because it's going to go through a digestive process.
Mm-hmm.
The way we generally organize ketamine treatment at home is that we have you hold this medicine in our mouth for a while. It's kind of one of the most difficult parts of this treatment because the medicine doesn't taste amazing. It doesn't taste awful. It doesn't taste great. It tastes kind of medicine-y. So for some people, this is really difficult. And for others, it's it's not so bad. But the rule of thumb is for most of the rapid dissolving tablets, which is, I think, most commonly used, troches too, but rapidly dissolving tabs, they dissolve over 8 minutes in our mouth. So there's this period
Not too bad.
Yeah, not terribly bad. They're going to dissolve into this fluid, and we're going to hold this fluid in our oral mouth here for about 10 to 15 minutes.
Okay.
We're actually going to swish it back and forth a few times even because we really want to coat the oral membranes to get this really good absorption, to maximize the absorption. So we're getting the full potency available to us. I think that period of time, some of us may do meditation during that time period, right? Just kind of meditate as we're absorbing, receiving this medicine. Some of us may just need to use distraction. So sometimes I'll think of a prayer, or I may even watch like nature videos. So like whatever works for you, because it can be, sometimes I'm like, is it been literally 3 minutes? Like it feels like it's been, an hour. So getting through that hold period is kind of the most, I'd say, difficult part of the treatment in general. Our mouth also can cause kind of a hypersalivatory response. So we're getting like extra like fluid in our mouth. So I always tell folks, like, if your mouth is just too full and you're starting to drool, go ahead and spit a little out, like have a cup nearby, like spit a little out. You're not going to lose a ton of medicine, and it can absolutely help with just making this something you can get through. And at the end of the 10 to 15 minutes, whatever your prescriber has recommended, you are actually going to spit out this medicine. The reason for that is because if we do swallow the medicine, and there are lots of reasons I ask someone to swallow or swallow a little bit of the medicine, yes, it can increase the intensity of the experience. It also tends to increase side effects because we're getting this like first pass GI metabolism. We get more kind of grogginess, we get more nausea. What I'm able to typically do is get you to a psychedelic threshold, or the threshold we're looking for, without ever needing to swallow. But I always kind of want to frame that as though there are reasons I ask folks to swallow some or all of the medicine, depending on where we are with treatment. So I generally start people without needing to swallow it, only because it increases side effects for a lot of us. So for most of us, we're going to spit it out after this 10 to 15 minutes. Hopefully we've gotten through it and we're distracted a little bit, or we had some prayer or meditation. And after we've spit it out, I think it's kind of normal to get a little bit of oral numbness. So it does have a little bit of an kind of anesthetic quality. So it can cause some of this like oral numbness in our mouth. And for those of us with anxiety, this can be a little altering. So I always mention that that's perfectly normal. It's not going to cause any trouble, but it is kind of worth mentioning. And now that we spit out the medicine, even some folks will start to feel a little bit of it during this hold period. They may start to feel more relaxed or sedated a little bit. You might start to feel a bit altered, and that's really normal because ketamine has a very rapid onset. It generally, we start to feel this medicine within about 10 minutes for most of us. So it really does kind of come on pretty quickly. So it's good to already be prepared. I've had folks that are like, oh, I just finished this meeting, I'm going to hold the medicine. And it doesn't tend to work well that way, because we really want to be, as we already talked about, prepared to kind of enter the non-ordinary state and prepared to kind of go straight into this experience, because it doesn't waste a lot of time.
Okay. So as you said, so at the end, when we're spitting the medicine, or in some cases that you will ask to swallow, and at that point the experience is starting, right?
Yeah. Definitely. So it takes a few moments, and I'll be honest, some folks, it may take a little longer. There are people that are like, 20 minutes or 30 minutes in, they're not feeling much. This is a medication that is so nuanced, and it's highly regulated by some of our metabolism. So we kind of covered a lot of the other things in prep that can help this, but having cleaner meals, things like that prior to your fasting period, and really observing the fasting period can make this more kind of predictable in a lot of ways. So for most of us, this is going to come on pretty quickly. Every once in a while, I'll have someone that's like, it didn't start for 30 or 40 minutes. So being prepared to just enjoy some meditation, some relaxation time until you start to feel the impact is important, because it can, there's a little bit of a spectrum of time that we can experience the onset. But for most of us, it's much quicker than we expected. So being prepared to enter that state pretty quickly. And then
sorry, I was gonna ask, like, and then, but are you going to keep the medicine in your mouth till you feel it, or still like after that window of those 10, 15 minutes to 15 minutes, you spit it out anyway, and then you wait?
Good question. I think a lot of folks tend to hold it as I've prescribed, which is 10 to 15 minutes. There are some folks that really do go, there's some like deep dive Reddit articles out there that are like, hold it for 45 minutes or, longer. Some folks really do hold it for a bit longer. And this is just something I generally recommend that you talk to your prescriber about. Like, make sure you guys have a clear plan, like what's working for you. Like, as a side note, I think what we'll probably discover in like years to come is that each of us have our own kind of unique microbiofilms in our mouth or oral pH that may alter the way we absorb this medicine. So some of us may need to hold it a bit longer to get like the best absorption. I even sometimes have folks do like an oral rinse beforehand, like warm salt water or brush your teeth, just to kind of clear out our mouth and prepare to like receive this medicine and kind of maximize the absorption. But in general, most people are going to feel it pretty quickly. They're going to spit it out after 10 or 15 minutes. And I think we covered all of this in prep, but you'll have everything already set up. You'll have your spit cup nearby. You'll have your sitter, kind of wherever they're supposed to be near you or kind of in earshot of you. And I think at that point, maybe we've already thought about our intention, and Melissa and I are going to go into kind of a more deep dive in intentions in another podcast. But in general, setting, kind of the intention while we have the medicine in mouth, like I'm just here to surrender to my higher self, maybe to grow or to heal or just to explore, keeping kind of a more broad architecture to the intention. And after we've spit this medicine out, I generally recommend most of us just go ahead and lay down and prepare for the experience to begin. This may be something that we want to use like an eye mask for that can be really soothing and pleasant. Or for me, I don't like things on my face. It makes me feel a little claustrophobic. So I just close my eyes, which is perfectly fine as well.
There's also like meditation pillow, like for the eye pillow that you can put. So maybe, I don't know, for some people that may feel claustrophobic because the eye mask, like you feel it very tight. That one is just like on your eyes. You can have like some lavender or things like that.
Yeah, I love that. And that's a great addition because that gives a little bit of pressure without it feeling like restrictive, which
Exactly.
I don't want. So. But I think that's a great tip. And by all means, like whatever you're comfortable with. I think the one thing we should probably note, especially inside the experience, is pets. We want to keep our pets safe, but also they are a huge source of comfort for us. So I want people to think about this, like having your pets near you during the experience. With ketamine, most of us aren't moving around a ton. It does tend to have a bit of more like a sedative type quality to it. But having our pets nearby, I've had all kinds of animals. So I've had animals that'll just lay there with me the whole time and be so gentle and soothing. I've also had other animals that are a little bit more kind of busy and I just want people to be thoughtful about it. There's no wrong or right answer there, but making sure your pets are cared for and that they're safe and that aren't going to be terribly distracting to your experience, I think is at least worth putting some thought into.
Yeah.
Find the best solution for like your home environment, I think.
And then when you lay down, is it best to have like a pillow or something behind you so that your little, like your spine, you're not completely like all laid down, just a little. I'm just thinking because as it is dissociative and sedative, like I don't want anyone to have their saliva go on the wrong side while they're on the medicine. So maybe if you have something that pulls you up a little, that can prevent that.
So it does tend to actually decrease our work of breathing. So there are some folks that I actually do want to be elevated. Those with like a history of obstructive sleep apnea, they may even use their sleep machines during their experience.
Oh, okay.
And a couple of other conditions that your provider will talk to you about in specific cases. A lot of us will be perfectly fine just laying down in our normal kind of sleep position. But that's not to say that there isn't other positioning. I've had folks use like their massage chairs at home. I've had folks have like kind of zero gravity chairs and things that they've enjoyed using. So I think sitting or reclining, it's really just about being really comfortable. You are spot on because it is a dissociative type psychedelic. So we tend to have a bit more of that brain and body disconnection where it's maybe harder to move your arms the way you think you should or get up and move around. So you want to be in a position that's going to be comfortable, that you may not have to move around a ton. Save for perhaps getting up to use the restroom, you should be in a position that's very comfortable for you, that you can maintain. So for those of us with back issues or neck issues, you really want to set yourself up to be as comfortable as possible because you may be in that position for another hour or so. Yeah, but I think positioning is important.
And so also like comfortable clothes and easy to remove clothes. If you go to the bathroom, you do want to think about how to remove like, I don't know, a belt or jeans.
Yes. Definitely. That can be really complicated. So, yes, being thoughtful about what we're using. And I just generally tend to think of this experience as like this beautiful act of self care. So, I really maximize my comfort, like really cozy clothes, really cozy bedding, or wherever you're going to be kind of set up. I think all of that can really play well to the sense of relaxation and moving into kind of this like therapeutic container of this non ordinary state so that we're prepared to, rather than have our environment distract, we're prepared to kind of enjoy whatever might be here for us, to learn, to grow, to heal, all of the things that are here for us in the non ordinary state. So, less restrictive clothes tend to work better because they can be a bit distracting in the experience. You'd be like, oh, it's a little tight or that's a little uncomfortable. So, thinking about those things is wise.
And I imagine also a nice blanket, because anytime we do a relaxation of any kind, like also in yoga, shavasana, or yoga nidra, you need a blanket because your body temperature drops a little bit. So I imagine
Yeah,
here even more.
absolutely. So, having something you could pull across you if you're a little chilly, or your partner might, or your peer support, but also something you could remove if you were a little warm. Sometimes I've had a little sunlight coming through the window and I'm like, I'm actually a little warm right now. So something, yeah, that's easily kind of can give you comfort for temperature as well is
Okay.
important.
So even if it's dissociative, you can still feel warm or cold.
Yeah.
You
I
still
think
have those
definitely,
sensations during the experience.
definitely. And there may be states
Okay.
that we reach with the intensity that's less common, but we're usually not arriving. It's surrounding that intensity is usually sometimes where we're pretty aware of our body. And I think that brings us to a great kind of jumping off point as to like, how does this feel? And it's
Mm-hmm.
so hard to say like how it feels all the time for any one person because there's a pretty wide range. But I think we could cover a few of the things that it sometimes most of us might experience. I think ketamine specifically tends to have kind of this unique, for the most part, it's got a bit of like anxiolytic. So it tends to decrease anxiety. We feel a little more relaxed. We feel a little bit more sedated in some ways. So for some of us, this feels a little sleepy. And for others of us, it's like this beautiful kind of adult timeout where we have a little less narrative running. We have a little less kind of to do list in our brain. And I think approaching it that way is like leaning into that is very wise. I
Mm-hmm.
think that a lot of us may feel a little tingly. We might feel a little bit of like our arms and legs are a little heavier. Our body in general may feel a little bit heavier, especially as the onset of this medicine starts, where we're starting to kind of feel the impact. A lot of us may feel a bit of dizziness as well. So it is kind of wise to just lay down and embrace it rather than try to be continuing to do things while this is starting, because a lot of us will have more blurry vision. We could have some dizziness or spinning sensation, which is really common. I had one experience that I felt like I was literally almost the entirety of the experience spinning into the funnel of a flower. So it was this beautiful, almost Alice in Wonderland type experience of like spinning into the funnel of this beautiful calla lily. But it can come with that. And I think when we are able to fold that into the experience, it can be this kind of beautiful event versus this kind of disruptive or kind of uncomfortable event. But it's fairly common to have that sensation. Also, a bit more relaxing. So, some of us may be so drowsy that we're tempted to fall asleep. And I generally recommend trying not to. I think we miss a lot of the experience and what the experiential benefit is when we are so sleepy that we're actually going to like real REM and NREM sleep. Yes, you'll still get some neurobiological like benefit out of it, but we tend to lose that experiential
Mm-hmm.
impact. So I do recommend, even if you're really relaxed and comfortable, try not to fall asleep inside the experience. Try to be present for what is here. I think that's valuable. And it may kind of, I think, like other medicines, it may have a bit of a wave like crescendo. So we start to
Okay.
feel the impacts where it's a little more sedated, a little more relaxed. We might start to feel a little bit of heaviness in the body.
Mm-hmm.
Some people report this like feeling like they're flowing with the music, like they become more one with
Mm-hmm.
music and tones and frequencies. Some folks will have visuals right away, and other people will not. There is a known condition called aphantasia.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that we can perfectly explain it here, but what it is typically that some folks may not have very vivid visuals. They may not have a whole lot that comes up in this kind of inner landscape. I tend to think of it though as like our brain often offers us exactly what we need. So those of us with these really rich inner creative vivid landscapes on our own may sometimes actually need less of that, and our experience offers us more kind of just peaceful kind of time out experience. So it is about embracing whatever it is that comes up for us, and that could be so many things. And I think you've probably got a pretty wild amount of experience in this area as well, right? Like, to talk about all the things that could come up in an experience is just crazy, because it's this huge evolving spectrum of things into each individual's memories and all these metaphors, etc.
Mhm.
But
But
it could be, right?
sorry, I'm really curious about, because as you said, it's a dissociative. So there's you feel less of your body, and with some other psychedelic, particularly with me with ayahuasca, it tends to be less visual and more embodying. So it's not even embodying in the sense that I feel my body more, but I feel everything through my body. So my body becomes really, and it normally always is, but even more, everything is enhanced. And really, I can sense all these other states, like
Mm,
energies. It's hard to describe, but like
yeah.
everything through my body, and also my body, like in a sense, let's say, talks to me in the sense that I was able in different ceremonies to discover more and more of how certain traumas or certain things were like stuck in my body, in certain place of my body. um and so I'm really curious to, as you said it's dissociative. Do people have this experience of actually like be more connected with the body
Yeah.
in this sense?
We absolutely can. And I have had clients that felt that way. It's typically less of a physical sense and more of a felt sense. So, like, more of this kind of like amygdala type behavior. So, we get more of this like felt sense. So, I've had folks that have had trauma. And I think it's an important kind of
Mm-hmm.
disclaimer here is that those of us with a lot of like unresolved trauma in our past, it's always possible this can come up. So this should always be approached with psychotherapy or coaching or someone that's familiar with your history, because it can be alarming when traumas do come back up. For those of us that have done a lot of trauma reprocessing already or trauma work and are informed, some of these experiences I've had folks have very deliberate and kind of very eye-opening experiences of traveling through their own bodies and even being able to almost visualize and have this felt sense of like, I'm storing this. Like, this is why this is heavy. Like, this is why this feels stuck. This is why my shoulders, whatever it might be. So I think people very much can still have that type of experience where we have this deep felt sense of especially storage facility in our body, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, we know our cellular DNA stores our trauma and it expresses it. So there is some somatic work to that. I've had some folks kind of tap into kundalini energies and have more, although uncommon to move around a lot, actually start kind of moving a bit more and moving like energy through body. So some really beautiful stuff can happen. It just tends to lean towards more of that side of being more introspective, more kind of mental and
Okay.
cerebral than it does physical. But that is not to say it doesn't happen, because it absolutely
Okay.
does.
Okay. But it's more, as it says, cerebral, more like
Yeah,
visions, more like insights.
it can be. So, and that I think is where ketamine is. I think that all the medicines vary to some degree. It tends to be a little less physically interactive. So we're not as likely to want to like open our eyes and engage with our environment. And when we do, a lot of the visual landscape may look distorted. In our mind, I've had, clients have visits with dead loved ones. I've had them feel as though they're meeting with like extraterrestrials or like spirits, guides. I've had folks revisit very specific acute childhood memories, like with vivid detail, like every moment of it. I've had folks believe that they have become a different type of being. And in general, like kind of those overarching themes we see, and that we see with lots of medicines, is this kind of sense of connection or a
Yeah.
connectedness to something beyond self, right? Like this inner kind of connectedness of energy that is all things, right?
Mhm.
So all that's ever been, all that will ever be. And I do tend to see that theme emerge with like deeper, kind of more intense experiences with
Yeah.
ketamine. And I do think that's kind of common amongst a lot of the medicines, is like this deeper sense of connection or belonging.
Mhm.
Um, to something more than self, right? To something more than just our own energy. And I think that's what's so beautiful about the experiential impact, is that sometimes we get these things only through stretching our consciousness versus, I think similarly, like in deeper meditation states, right? Or flow
Mhm.
states, we can achieve this. This is just such a direct portal to that, right? Like this is
Mhm.
just usually where this is heading. So
Yeah,
do you find that's common with other medicines?
absolutely. I think, as you said, like altered state of consciousness, that's where you tap into this other dimension that, if you want, it's always there, but we are so engaged with our mind narrative that we don't connect with that. Uh, but definitely we can, yes, this sense of oneness, this sense of connectiveness with everything, everyone, every being, every known being, also everything in the universe. I think it's always there. And this reminded me of a beautiful quote that I read recently, but I won't be able to say it exactly. But the idea was that this medicine is not that they're not like a miracle pills, but they're able to show us that something else exists. And so they open the door. And when we can experience that, instead of here, we're all one, still it's not in our experience, we cannot light that fire of hope or knowing that, yes, there's something more. So now I can do the work to be there all the time.
Yeah.
And mhm.
That's beautiful. And I love even the analogy of like opening the door, because I
Mhm.
think that's often the kind of difference with like reality, right? Like our reality, we talk about it so often, but our reality is really what our brain's programming says it is, right?
Mhm.
Like it's why certain people look at something and see different colors, or
Mhm.
when we talk to each other, I may understand it this way and you may understand it that way. Our realities are organized very differently.
Mhm.
And I think the opportunity to kind of stretch this consciousness into the non-ordinary state really allows us to see it creates this ability for perspective, because we now see that our reality is not the only reality, may not even be the right reality, right? Or the
Mhm.
truest reality. So it opens this door of consciousness that I think that's such a beautiful quote that kind of
Mhm.
sums it up. But it really does start to kind of, not that we want to question reality. No one has time to do that in their everyday life. Like we can't constantly question all of our reality. But I think it's an opening, right, to see that, like, to develop our perspective and insight into that there could be more than this kind of tiny little universe I've organized inside of my lens, right?
Mhm.
And that connectedness, I think, is where we really start to feel a sense of belonging, where you start to reach deeper states of community. We start to reach deeper states of like interconnectedness and intra-connectedness, right? Like connected to self more. I think
Yeah.
it was really powerful for me. I lost my dad 2 years ago to COVID, all things. And
Oh.
I remember having a ketamine session afterwards, several months afterwards, that I had realized all of his energy was all still here. The love that we had was still here. It will never go anywhere, even though some of the reality of his presence has changed. And I remember understanding it so differently when I left that experience than I did prior. And I found such
Mhm.
a sense of peace in that, and such a sense of like this kind of remaining connection here, like that hadn't changed. And it was so satiating to feel like,
Yeah.
oh, I get it now in a different way. And I think for a lot of us, that's what we're able to develop, is that type of insight, that type of like connection where something just didn't make sense before. And it's not that I don't have grief still, it's simply that it feels different, right?
Oh, that's so beautiful. Thank you for sharing this.
Yeah. It was really special to me. And I think ketamine and all the medicines offer some of these opportunities for us
Mhm.
to become the observer of self, see our kind of programming differently, see our realities with a different kind of lens, And the good news is that is temporary, right? Because we don't necessarily want to live in a psychedelic state, right? Like I still got to go to work and like feed the dog and, go for walks. But it allows me to kind of fold this into this reality for me. And for me, it has brought such a different sense of peace, understanding, space, and grace for like all of the experiences on life. And I think when we're talking more specifically with ketamine and ketamine treatments for like reduction of anxiety and depression, we're talking about, I think at least we're closer to the idea of root cause and origin of like, where does that begin? Where does this sadness, this fear, this anxiety, these kind of thought processes, where do they begin? Right. And sometimes it is that there's a moment, and other times, like you were kind of talking about with trauma in the body, sometimes there is a moment that this begins, or there's a concept that this surrounds, or there are little roots in the ground from where this began initially. Maybe it was our programming we received as kids or from the society. And I think this is what allows us to open that door to kind of changing the way that those thoughts work, right?
Yeah, and exactly as I said, like thoughts for depression and anxiety, there are like the same thoughts, like this sort of radio in your brain, critics that keeps telling you so many bad things, and it's like the vision becomes so narrows inside your brain, and you're not able to see there's many other truths and many other feelings. You're just able to see one thing and one outcome, in a sense, like that everything is bad and everything is terrible. It always will be this way. And that's very narrow. And with this kind of medicine, that opens up to all these other possibilities. And also, you said like ketamine can like shut off this radio. Finally, find a button to turn that off.
Yes, it turns down that frequency, which is I think so important when we want to develop space and we are trying to install these healthier templates, right? And I think that's so valuable, which is why I think, we've seen a lot in the press and psychedelic spotlights right now talking about, isolating the kind of psychoactive, basically making the psychedelic experience or like the part of ketamine or any other medicine that works well without the experience, which I think is so valuable for certain populations, right? When we're talking about maybe our schizoaffective, schizophrenic type patients with like contraindications to doing psychedelics, this may be very useful. And not or, but and I feel like it also perhaps removes some of the experiential benefit for those that this is very valuable, because I always defend that this type of treatment is valuable for the neurobiological benefits that we get from it, right? From medicines, but also this experiential impact where we have perhaps something that comes up that allows us to develop these insights or have this kind of peaceful time out. I think the kind of theme, right, is that they can be almost anything. Yeah. And I'd like to talk a little bit about metaphor, right? So do you find that like with other medicines that like our brain uses very interesting metaphor?
You opened a door that I'm a linguistics. Don't talk to me about language, whatever metaphors. I'm able to talk for hours, but yes, let's go. I love this.
We should probably do another sequence on just metaphor alone. But I think it's so important to like realize that often what our brain is doing, especially when it's like unencumbered by like our traditional like programming or thought patterns, processes, it creates some very vivid kind of metaphor. And I almost think of metaphor as the way that our brain is giving us these beautiful imagery of the way it's rewiring or restructuring as within the context of the psychedelic experience. Do you find that metaphor is common throughout all the medicines?
Okay, I can tell you even more. So not only about my experience so with medicine, but like my experience as I don't know, multi-language person, as I speak 4 languages. And on top of that, I'm also a translator. So that's another important element that you're going to understand why. So as a translator, when I translate from one language into the other language, so what happens, I was able to discover this even before medicine. So what happens is like our brain, we think in language. We don't think in language. Our brain before the language, and that's the process of a translator. So I don't translate English in Italian. I take the English, I have to translate it into how the brain works, which is images. So I go step back, images, concepts, feelings. Okay, so and from that, I translate that, which is how the brain actually thinks into Italian, for example, or vice versa, whatever. So like, and that's why like when I talk with you in English, I'm not thinking in Italian. I'm thinking in how my brain thinks, and then I translate it in English. But it's so quick, and if you do not translate, not know another language that well, you never have that experience. And so like metaphors are so valuable because that's actually how our brain thinks. And that helps also because when we use language, our logic brain puts a lot of filters. Right? Because there's all these filters of the language. That is also all structure. When we talk about also about society, what we learn, there's a lot that comes from language, because like language is a word on itself. So how a language structure the world around you, another language structure it in different ways. That's the beauty of learn multiple languages, for example. And so when also you talk with metaphors, not only you go direct to the source of thoughts, because that makes it more clear of what it is, but also you bypass those filters.
It's mind-blowing to think about it that way. Like, and from your lens on like from linguists, right? Like this multiple language and like the way you have to construct this, it's almost as if it takes it back to like as you said, like to the beginning, right? Which is how we actually think, which is conceptually, right? And like through metaphor. I even have probably a bigger rabbit hole, but do you think this relates to storytelling, right? Like,
oh yes,
think about ancestral storytelling and like the way we pass down story, and often full of metaphor, right? I think there's something to that as well. And I think there's a related concept to the way that psychedelics work, and why with many psychedelics, we lose command over some of our language centers, right? Language isn't as fluent. We aren't as well versed, maybe not as articulate as we might be, but we certainly have a stronger surge of metaphor and or conceptual thinking, right? Where we're really deep diving in like the neuroscience of this. And I don't know that I could break it all apart, like in the science, but I know from experience and from working with thousands of patients with this, I see a theme and I see some relationships here that I think are very profound, and especially with storytelling, because I think often the psychedelic experience is almost this big, it's like our brain is telling us a story in a strange way, right? Like this is ancestral storytelling aspect to it. And I think metaphor and storytelling are very closely related as well. Do you feel the same?
Absolutely. I think that's why all this the ancient traditions and the ancient wisdom comes through storytelling, being fairy tales or being like the Bhagavad Gita and so on. It's or the Bible. It's all storytelling for that reason, because if you write a research paper like nowadays, even like a research paper of 20 years ago, it doesn't have the same like rules that we have now. Like the rules have developed in the university so that everyone follows certain standard, so that the that can be understood, and they try to avoid every ambiguity. That's the importance in research, avoiding ambiguity. But that is like with times changes. So people in 100 years would not be able to understand it correctly and may find ambiguity in those research papers, for example. But the stories are, that's why they talk to us, and they're also so open to, yes, they're open to interpretation, but also they are so powerful that the story comes with you. I felt that many times, either parables or fairy tales or other stories, they comes with you, and according to what you're experiencing in life, they're telling you and giving you a different message as well.
Yeah, I so agree. And I have found that I think storytelling sometimes tends to be more impactful. And maybe it's because it's a deeper form of language, right? Or a deeper form of the way we think, right? So it resonates in a different part of our brain, or it's more captivating in some ways. And I think there's some relationship to the psychedelic experience. And to kind of fold it all together to like make this like somewhat nebulous concept kind of come back to the experience. For example, in metaphor, like I always have this really strange animal totem that comes through and I never understand it. Like half the time I'm like, who's this? So one of the last times was this porcupine. And I was like, I don't think I've even ever seen a porcupine in real life, right? Like I wasn't really sure what this metaphor was offering me. And I think this is a really common theme in psychedelic experiences and in more intense spaces. You may not understand it right away, right? Like sometimes the story doesn't make sense. Sometimes the metaphor doesn't make sense. And I actually, when I came to my normal self and kind of evaluated it, it actually took me a couple of weeks to kind of chew on it and digest it. And I finally looked at it and I finally said, well, what is a porcupine? And I realized porcupine's got this really harsh exoskeleton with the quills, right? And like the kind of mean, aggressive body. But if you flip them over, they have this adorable, soft, cute underbelly. And I realized instantly what my brain's metaphor was trying to offer me is that sometimes I have kind of this tougher exterior and I also have a softness, and it's kind of this balancing. That's a very personal metaphor for me, but I find that a lot of folks have these kinds of metaphors that kind of emerge as themes in their experiences. And some of them will make perfect sense. Some of them will make sense over time. And some of them aren't necessarily meant to make sense in the way we think of that, right? Like they're just here to do the work and the rewiring and storytelling and brain that they're here to do. Do you find that that's what you see with other medicines?
Yeah, absolutely. I know there's people that reports they see like I know some Egyptian visuals or some like more archetypal visuals. And then there's, as you said, very, very individual metaphors. But I also like encourage or invite everyone that see those more archetypal visuals to also do not, even if it's a temptation to research, right? Because maybe there's something that is archetypal and you've never seen before, and then that corresponds to something that actually existed in the past. So it's very tempting and fascinating, but also invite to explore what it means for you. That's probably it's different, and it's an individual meaning. But also like this very, very, very individual, like you said, porcupine. That's there's no Egyptian god of porcupines. I don't think so. But
we should
yes.
be. But yeah, definitely.
And
Well,
so
I think that's the uniqueness of it, right? Is like it is our own brain kind of using the images it's seen before, these archetypal type, runes and visuals, or perhaps some random porcupine or roadrunner going through. But I think it is our brain's way of using metaphor to tell a story. A lot of that will relate to the way that I think our brain is actually doing some rewiring or restructuring or making sense of something. So some of that needs to make sense in our conscious brain. Not all of it, I think, is the other part of it, right? So there isn't always, we don't always have to make sense of everything.
Yeah. So I also just a little bit of a question for you, because in ayahuasca, for example, when there are images like that, maybe not the first time, but like when someone has already done a couple of ceremonies and is already a little bit more comfortable with the ceremony, I invite them to, when there's some image, and this is when there's some image that they don't understand, okay? Or sometimes there can come some image that you don't like, right? A monster or whatever. And so you may try to reject that, and that can open the following part of like when you have an experience you don't want what to do. But let's stay with the images. I always invite to just ask, who are you? What are you? Show me more. I don't understand. And normally you have a further answer. So would you suggest the same in ketamine, just to question? Tell me more, explain me more. I don't understand this. Like you're trying to tell me something but I don't understand it. Show me more.
Absolutely. And also, I'm going to step back one step before that to say that I think the concept underlying that is one of the most important concepts, and it's the idea of curiosity. I think that curiosity component is often, especially in ketamine treatment, right? Because we are working more specifically with patients with PTSD and anxiety and depression. Curiosity is one of the first things to kind of get swallowed whole when our symptoms are overwhelming. We lose the sense of curiosity about wonder. And that's often because we already know the outcome, right? It's all going to be bad. Like we kind of already talked about. We have these like really deep kind of imprinted patterns in our brain that have already informed us that if we're curious, it's just going to turn out awful, or it's going to fall apart, or the other shoe's going to drop, or I'm not good enough, or whatever these networks are telling us. And I think that's the concept of curiosity that often comes back. And so being able to fold it into the experience, to have curiosity and say, ooh, to show me more, or what else, right? What else is such an important question in regular communication and also in this internal dialogue, right? Like what's underneath that? So it almost brings me back to the analogy of like, you could say the onion, or I like the 1,000-petal lotus. There are rungs and rungs of petals, right? It's always what's underneath that rung and what's underneath that rung of petals. And I think that really embodies the exact thing you're talking about, which is that sense of curiosity as to like, what are you here to show me? What am I here to see? Like, show me more. It really is that leaning in, and it really is that curiosity. Does
Yeah,
that kind
absolutely.
of
Yeah, absolutely. And it just, this reminded me of, like, for example, as I said, there's a bad image you don't like that maybe scares you, you don't want to see it, or vice versa. And there's many, I heard many people saying that when they ask, then that transforms, and maybe something that looked ugly then becomes beautiful things, and it's the part of you that just wanted to be accepted. And vice versa, something that looked beautiful that was hiding something that actually was not that beautiful, but again, that needed to be like healed in some way, just was hiding a trauma. So the curiosity and ask, it's beautiful. You can do so much more work in during this treatments or ceremonies or states.
Yes, I think that's exactly spot on. And I think that's, especially because ketamine is typically done in a series of doses, it may be themes that you confront occasionally and not always. But it's important to kind of have these tools in your toolbox, because you never know what's going to come up in your experience. And you're never really like, I think that in earlier, like lighter doses of ketamine, yes, you still have enough narrative to somewhat direct the experience. But I think that's one aspect, is that psycholytic dose realm. That's where we do a lot of psychotherapy in session. We might work through something. I often will tell patients, using these lower dose profiles where we still have a bit of narrative, we still have a bit of direction, kind of driving the bus still, they can be very powerful when we are processing a specific thing, maybe a relational issue, maybe something that's going on in life, maybe a pattern of behavior. But then I think it's important we talk about some of the more intense experiences, right? Where we do have less narrative, we do have less control or direction, we maybe lose some bit of language. Like, first and foremost, I've had these experiences. I think you've had these experiences where you're kind of at the mercy of where this medicine is taking you, and you've lost a bit of that control to say, I feel uncomfortable or I don't like this, or what have you. So let's talk a little bit then, I guess, about, I think it's a beautiful segue to talk about, like, what do you do when things feel a bit tense, or you feel a bit overwhelmed by what's coming up or what you're seeing? What can you do to kind of still get something out of this and maintain like some bits of composure here? What helps?
You ask me? Well, in general, I would say for other psychedelic, definitely the breath is the number one. The breath is the number one always. That would be, I also like when I do coaching to prepare someone for this kind of experience, I have them do some preparation, some exercise around the breath and just do some sort of meditation that are actually exercise, and just with our eyes closed, just focus on the breath, even, and observing the emotions. And maybe they can also, if it's a guided meditation, like they can like think of something that give them anxiety, and just so with the breath observe the anxiety. All right, so out of these states it's easier, and so that's why it's a practice, so that when you are in those states you can practice that, and you can remember to focus on your breath and be the witness of whatever is happening.
Oh, that's so important. And I think you brought up a beautiful point about like having some practice with this prior. So definitely part of the prep and setting ourselves up for success. And I think that holds true for ketamine as well. So having that ability to return back to our breath
Yeah.
is one of the most peaceful kind of recentering, regrounding practices, right? Like I've done this. I'm sure you've done this. Like I've had patients do it. Return back to your breath. It's something that's always present. And when we return to it, it definitely lowers, I mean, we know for lots of reasons, it lowers our anxiety levels. It absolutely gets us more centered and present. And it takes the focus off the thing, right? Whatever that might be, it pulls it back internally to some degree. I think breath is really important. The other thing I sometimes recommend is, especially with ketamine, because we might have our eyes closed, and this might be a very internal landscape, open our eyes. Opening our eyes is sometimes, you can look around and say, this is the architecture of my room. It may look a little different, but there's a familiarity there, right? Like there's like these walls of my room. This is the ceiling of my room. This is the floor of my room. Like that type of familiarity can be very, I think, grounding for a lot of us and recentering. And I think that those types of practices, when we feel like we're very intense or too intense, there is this bit of surrender here that I think it can be challenging for all of us, and especially for those with a history of trauma. I think that's the part that really gets tricky, right? Because there's an aspect of this that's this surrender component. We want to be able to surrender to this stretch of consciousness, to this journey, to this experience. So the way I actually frame that makes me feel safer is that I always try to keep as a pillar in the back of my mind that I'm never surrendering to anything else. I'm just surrendering to my higher self. And that sometimes I think for me makes me feel safer and a little bit more grounded and a little bit more present in my own body. I don't know that for sure it's a control thing, but it's also like a safety issue, right? Like wanting to feel safe. And I think that's the underlying principle. You find, Mel, that like, I think we could do a whole other thing on surrender because surrender is such a difficult concept. But
yes, there's
do
lots
you
of
frame,
nuances.
there is this aspect though, right? Of like needing to be able to surrender to some degree. And I think when we resist that is often where we get kind of anxious, right? Like we get a little angsty about like, oh, I don't want to go deep in that. I want to have control, right? So there's an important component of learning to surrender, right? Because we do not control everything. But there's also this like background issue of safety, right? And like honoring our internal like safety boundaries and things like that. So that's why I have to kind of frame it in a tricky way that like I'm surrendering to my higher self versus I'm surrendering to this unknown, right?
I love that. I love that. It's beautiful,
Yeah.
I think, because we
Well,
know
and I
that,
think,
I think we all feel our higher self is there for
yeah,
our highest interest.
yes,
So giving it
yeah,
to this higher power that has our interest, our back,
yes,
it's a great way. I love it.
yeah,
And
and it feels more loving and more supportive.
yeah, so I have a question. Like, what about like, we know it's a dissociative, but like with other medicine, like some people find that touching something, so focus on the touch, that can help
Mm,
if something is a little overwhelming.
yes, yeah, and I think I've had patients have experiences where it is more difficult to actually move your body. So if you're finding that's difficult, I think sometimes it can help if this is where peer support can be very valuable. And I know this varies a little bit from medicine to medicine, but I have had folks use their peer support person and maybe they have a signal of some kind they've already discussed. tapping or just if
Mm.
maybe an anxious look on my face, where the peer support can actually come in. And if you've discussed this, having touch can be very soothing, right? Like maybe just a
Mm.
hand or even some bits of language like breathe or you're safe. I think
Mhm.
sometimes those things can really be very reassuring and comforting. It's definitely something to talk about with like your peer support
Mhm.
person because we don't want to have touch that is inappropriate or
Yeah.
not welcomed. And sometimes we do need to be able to witness
Mhm.
and kind of experience this on our own. But I think that's one valuable part. And yes, for sure, if you're able to move around kind of freely, absolutely, there are tapping points we can do that can be very soothing. We can do all kinds of like gentle stroking of like the hip or the thigh can be really comforting to most of us. But it gets us kind of focused on movement again, like we do when we're anxious, right? We always say, go out, do something, move your body, right? It's the
Mhm.
same type of thing, just a little less easy to do on ketamine because then you
Mhm.
may not have this full direction of the body during that time.
What about like singing a mantra?
Absolutely. I think singing, prayer, chant is all very valuable. I think the most difficult part is that sometimes it's harder to access language in these
Mm.
states or memory. Um, if you're able to, and that's comforting by all means. I've had folks even have their peer support know, like if they're feeling challenged, like they change the song cadence because oftentimes we may find a bit of a heaviness. I think some of us may have just some association, right? Like with certain musical tones and frequencies. So it could, music itself could be part of what's bringing up these feelings. So perhaps
Mhm.
changing
Yeah.
the music, like moving to the next song, can be also very helpful. But if you're able to chant or have a mantra or have a prayer, absolutely. I think that's like or even just a one word, like coming back to love or coming back to self or safety, whatever it might be, can be very valuable. And that's why prep is so important for the experience.
Mhm.
But on the whole, right, I think we're making it sound awful like everyone has these challenging experiences, but I don't think that's the case. I think on the whole, especially when we set ourselves up well and we have good support and we're entering this with an open mind, I think the great majority of us have very positive experiences and somewhat relaxing or interesting or intellectual or cerebral or stimulating experiences.
Mhm.
I guess it's probably good that we talk a little bit about like the duration of this type of experience because this is
Mhm.
very different than most of our other medicines.
Yes.
We talked a little bit about the onset, so it could be within 10 to 15 minutes, and some people are a little longer. I'd say for this medicine, peak effects are most common at like 20 to 30 minutes. We
Okay.
may not have a good sense of time in the experience as that tends to go away pretty quickly. But it's good to know that the peak effects usually happen pretty quickly. And then the if full duration of this medicine is on the whole 60 to 90 minutes. So
Mhm.
this is a very brief encounter for most of us. So I think even having that in your mind's eye can help as well, like knowing that this is very temporary and it's going to end soon. So like knowing you're not trapped anywhere, this is just moving along.
Mhm.
Help. But I will find a lot of people will start to feel like they've reached the peak and they've come down that other side and they're starting to feel perhaps a bit more narrative. They might even have like, it's for dinner thoughts or like, I'm really
Mhm.
fast. Like some of the regular kind of
Mhm.
routine thoughts come in. And I usually encourage folks to stay a little longer because I do think that, like many other medicines, there's a bit of a wave like feeling here
Yeah.
where sometimes you may still have another little wave of something
Okay.
or
Mhm.
a bit more, I don't know, kind of ebb and flow in the experience.
Mhm.
So if you can, it's wise to take a little longer and just kind of enjoy that. Maybe it's more meditative or trance like than it is psychedelic. I think that's a beautiful part of the kind of aftermath of the experience. So I really encourage people to kind of stay for a few minutes if they can and enjoy that or see if there's a little bit more wave like to the experience. I've had people go back into, kind of secondary psychedelic experiences or have a little bit more out of something. So enjoy, it's kind of just savoring, right? Savor this moment of like beautiful self-care.
Maybe it's a
But
good time for sorry. It's a good time for journal, maybe.
yes, totally. And I
Mm.
even sometimes recommend because it's dissociative and has an anesthetic property, a lot of us find that like fine motor movement gets trickier.
Hmm.
So what I sometimes recommend is have like, I used to take notes in like physiology class with like my little recorder, the little voice recorder. But those can be beautiful to even give yourself voice notes, like so that you don't, or your phone, right? Your phones do this now and all the things, but you can record like audio notes to self, which may be more accessible than written word. By all means, if you're feeling like journaling, sometimes I'll jot down a few words just to kind of recall like what happened here, weird golden trumpet, cloud, pink clouds, whatever, is going on, just to kind of be able to revisit it. Other times I've had like voice notes, and a lot of the apps and things out there will even have these types of features where they'll have you, if you'd like to record voice notes to it. Sometimes I've had peer supports do little notes for me, like peer
Right.
support.
That's awesome.
Yeah, so it's a beautiful way to kind of have that experience together too. But yes, absolutely having something where you're able to kind of just unpack what's going on here, or even just kind of leave a little testimonial of what's happened here. I think that's an important part and can be a really beautiful way of letting the brain digest and kind of unpack. Yeah.
Right. That's beautiful. So, just do you have some last words to close the podcast, to close what the experience of ketamine like?
Yeah, I think as we've seen today, it has a lot of similarities to some of the other medicines and a bit of some differences here.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it also matters, what we're using this on for, therapeutic aspects that are a bit different for ketamine and the therapeutic container. But I think we did a good job at covering some of the maybes and what that happened in the experience. And as always, we're here just trying to create for each of us a deeper sense of like inner harmony. More to come. So next time, I think we're going to talk a little bit about post experience. So like
Exactly.
how to get the most out of like the after experience portion. We'll kind of unpack some of that. We hope to do some more on intention setting too, and maybe metaphor. Metaphor seems like a really fun topic. So
Yeah, we'll keep going.
yeah,
So,
good.
thank you so much, Rachel. This was amazing. And for anyone listening, if you have more questions, or if you want us to talk about some topics more, we will continue create more podcasts and more content. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you,
Have
everyone.
have a beautiful day, night, everything.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
All right. Bye bye. Oh no.